Hi everyone, Tim the Plane Man here, and welcome to Gee Bee Sportster E Flight Controller Edition. So it's time to do the electronics. Everything is pretty much mechanically good and ready to go. It's time to put the electronics in because I can't put the wings on until all the wires are in. So what I'm going to do with this plane, just to keep it interesting for some of us, is I'm going to be putting an ArduPilot flight controller into this plane. So I've basically positioned it here. If you can see in there, that's how the flight controller is going to be. I'm not going to have a pilot in the plane. I'm going to have an autopilot in the plane. The autopilot is going to sit right there in the cockpit. So what I'm going to do next is I haven't mounted that in there yet. That's just placed in there so you can see how it's going to be. This is the beautiful Qio-Tek H743 flight controller. I like it for a lot of reasons, including the fact that all the connectors are already made, and mostly what I need to do is just plug the right piece of equipment into the right socket, do some parameter setting. It is ArduPilot after all, and it'll work. There's no kind of soldering and figuring out which wire needs to go to which pad on the board and that kind of thing. It's really a very nicely packaged flight controller, and I really like it. Do highly recommend it. And I will be using this Zealot H743 flight controller to control this plane, and stay tuned, but we will be doing some very, very interesting things with that. So stick around if you're interested in connecting a flight controller in particular. Although it's kind of fun and interesting to see how I'm going to basically get this to work with the Sportster, the Gee Bee Sportster. But I've also had people ask me exactly how everything gets connected up to a flight controller. And I do have some videos that show how I've done this before with, for example, the Pix Racer, and also with the Zealot H743 that I have installed in my Solid model binary. But what I haven't done is shown connecting each component piece by piece, and that's what I'm going to do in this video. So it'll be long. Some of you, it'll be boring. Feel free to skip the whole video if that's not your thing, or you can skip to the end and see how it will look all connected together. I'll put the timestamps, the chapter markings on the video, and links in the description so that you can see how it looks at the end if you want to jump to that part, how everything will work, and it will work. But if you do need to see how do I connect the power, how do I connect an airspeed sensor, how do I connect the servos, how do I connect the ESC and the motor, there's going to be information about all of those pieces in this video. So stay tuned, should be fun. So here we have the Zealot H743 flight controller. As you can see, what I've already done is just wired some servo leads into the ports on the flight controller. And I've laid these out pretty standard AETR format. In other words, ailerons with a Y harness, which will go down to the aileron connection under the wing. That's connected to the first set of pins on the servo rail here. Elevator is connected to number 2. Throttle is connected to number 3, and rudder is connected to number 4. Now there is a reason for doing it, for me connecting this up like this for this particular build, and that is because once I mount that flight controller here inside the cockpit, it's going to be pretty much almost impossible, for example, to unplug or plug in those connectors if for whatever reason I need to unwire things, disconnect things in the plane, or even remove the flight controller, for example. So what I've done is I've just decided to put servo extension cables into the relevant ports on the flight controller here, and then I'll run those down inside the plane underneath, and then I'll be able to connect the relevant extension wire to either you can see I've got it here, to either the rudder and elevator, or to the ailerons, or to the ESC. So that will make it very easy to manage the wires going in and out of the flight controller sitting in the cockpit here by just running those down inside the plane and then connecting them from the inside. That also explains a little bit of a spider's web here, but it does make things quite simple and easy in terms of connecting everything. I'm going to talk now about connecting power. So there's two parts to power when you're running a flight controller, typically. Some very small flight controllers used on, for example, quads or copters and things like that can have their onboard power management, but most flight controllers, especially for planes and these kinds of things, have one of these, which is a separate power distribution board. And sometimes in a quad, this will be arranged in a stack with the flight controller on the top and then the power distribution board underneath. In a plane like this, it typically comes like this, and what you have here is 3 wires. The first wire is going to be battery input, so the battery will go in there. The second wire will go to the ESC. The third wire is how the flight controller is connected to power, and this does 2 things. One is it's power. This will power the flight controller. All of the control circuitry, the IMUs, the gyro, the built-in barometer, all of those things on the flight controller will be powered through this. The other thing this does is power monitoring. This will monitor the battery voltage and the current draw on the battery, and will then feed that in telemetry so that you can actually see that on your transmitter or on your ground control station. So this does a lot of important things. Now, this is one of the questions that I had
Tom, whereas Dick had the teacher's approval.
On my YouTube channel about people saying, well, I'm not really sure I understand how the power gets connected. So this is how that works. On this Zealot H743 flight controller, there's actually 2 power inputs. Power 1 on this side and power 2 on this side. And they both have the same, I think it's a 6 or 7 pin JST connector with the clip. You don't need 2 for a normal configuration, a normal installation. Typically 2 would be for some kind of power redundancy setup, or on a quad where you, for example, might have separate power. Sorry, on a quad, when I say quad, I mean a quad plane or a VTOL, where you might have separate power for your lift motors and different power for your forward motor. So I don't have that. In this case, we're keeping it simple. Power 1 will go here, and that is quick and simple and easy to do. Let's just plug the power connector in here. I think you can see that. Just going to make sure you can see that really nice and clearly. That plugs in here, and the JST-GH connector clicks in. So that clicks in now, that's nice and solid. Okay. Now what I have done with all of the leads that come out of the box with the Zealot H743, they're basically the bare wires, and all I've done is just twisted them and then tape them up so that they'll be nice and tidy inside, but they also won't come untwisted. All right, so here's our power distribution board. So that's step 1. Step 2, this is your ESC. Pretty much has, again, 3 things you need to know. One is that it's got to have power input. The power input in a normal build is going to be directly from a battery. With the ESC in your setup here, the standard way to do this will be to connect the ESC to the power distribution board. Let me grab a battery. I just use this battery just for bench power, just to demonstrate. So the power is going to go here. The power goes to the power distribution board. The power distribution board sends power to the flight controller and power telemetry, because it will be measuring the power draw through to the ESC, to the BEC, and to anything else that takes power off this side of the circuit. So that takes the power from the power distribution board through to the ESC and to the BEC. Now this output from ESC is your standard throttle output, input and output that you normally have in any RC plane. Typically this servo wire from the ESC goes straight into channel 3 of your receiver. On a Spectrum receiver, it would go into channel 1. On most other types of receivers, it'll go into channel 3. Either way, it goes into the throttle feed. Well, what we'll do here is we'll take our throttle wire here that I've set up, and we'll actually connect that to throttle, making sure to get the wires the right way around, white to white, red to red, black to black. So there we have that. So what that will do is that will power the servo rail. The only thing on the flight controller that doesn't get power through this power distribution lead here is the servo rail. It's on a separate power circuit. It's caused me problems, causes a lot of people problems. They connect their power distribution board to the flight controller, power everything on, the lights come on, and then they try to move the controls on the transmitter and nothing happens. The reason is you need to have separately power to the servo rail coming from your back off your ESC, and that will power the peripherals, usually servos only, but you know, it can be other things. You can have cameras and other things running off here, and that will all come off the back. Now this Skywalker Hobbywing 60 amp ESC that I've chosen for this one is actually quite good because it has a 7 amp back. So that can really power an awful lot from the back here. In fact, I don't really have much that I plan to run off it, so it should be fine. And there's really no need for a separate battery elimination circuit that might, you know, on some of my other builds, for example, on the binary, I've wired in a separate battery elimination circuit coming off the power distribution board just to run power to the cameras. In this case, I'm just going to use a simple Thumb Pro and doesn't draw much current, so it'll be fine. Now, I want to show you the motor. So in here, inside this hatch, that when I first opened the plane up, I mean opened the box, I didn't realize that there was this hatch in here. And so what I have is I have wired in a motor, and I've got bullet connectors off the motor here, and these bullet connectors are what is going to need to connect the ESC so that the motor will work. So as you probably know, and I'll say it again for the few of you who maybe haven't heard this already or need reminder, it doesn't really matter which order you put the wires onto the motor. If the motor is running in the wrong direction, just switch any two wires and the motor will run the right way. So we'll just put the ESC onto the motor like that. All right, so I've run the ESC down there, and the power distribution board is going to sit here. I want to make sure that that's visible, and then the cable from the power distribution board runs into the flight controller. That seems like that's quite okay. And so what I have here is I also have my servo wires for rudder and elevator coming out of the plane. Now this is not going to be like this when I finally connect it up. You know, these really long wires are, I'm going to disconnect these. Basically, I'll show you what I did. I just took a servo extension wire and plugged it into where the rudder and elevator are actually connected to the wire coming from the back of the plane here, just for the purposes of this demo, just so that I can connect it to the flight controller so that you can see everything. So I'm going to do that now. I'm just going to connect elevator to elevator, and I'll do that like this, elevator to elevator. So when I say elevator to elevator, I mean the elevator servo control wire that would normally on a regular receiver be plugged into port 2 AETR E on your receiver, or on Spectrum TAER, so it would be on port 3. And just like that. So pretty much all I've done is take an elevator, and although the wire is a little bit long, it's basically the same thing. I've just connected elevator to E on my flight controller, AETR. So that's connected to E. On Spectrum, it would be on E, which would be 3. I'll also do the same thing with rudder. The rudder connector goes to the rudder connector here. So that's R. And I don't have the wings in front of me, but we'll see about connecting that up later and see if I can get it to work without messing anything up in just the demo purposes. But I've got my ailerons, or my so A in terms of AETR on a, like I said, on a Y lead here, and that's running in port 1. I'm going to show you the rudder and elevator servos actually working with this flight controller a little bit later on in the video. I may or may not show you the ailerons, but it'll be the same. Like if the rudder and elevator are working, the ailerons are also going to work, and it'll work. Now we're getting into things that are specific to a flight controller. Except for one thing, I guess. What I should do next, before we jump ahead to things like GPS and Airspeed Sensor and that kind of stuff, let's just talk about receiver. Now the interesting thing about a receiver when you're connecting to a flight controller is because the flight controller has the servo connections on here, you don't need a receiver that has its own set of servo ports. In fact, even if you did have one, you wouldn't connect your servos to the receiver, because if you do, then the flight controller won't be able to do its magic. And it's quite possible you can take, you know, a pretty standard receiver like this, what is it called? It's a brick anyway. It's basically a Spectrum orange brick receiver with its own servo rail here. Now you can take that and run the S-bus out from that receiver and take it into the flight controller, and it'll work. But you don't need these servo ports, servo connectors on the receiver. You not only don't need them, you shouldn't use them. So why have all of that? Instead of that, I have this. Look how tiny that is. I mean, the antenna by itself is almost as big as the receiver itself. This is a Express LRS receiver. I've also had good experiences with FSX6B with iBus and SBus out to the flight controller, but I typically use Express LRS these days, and this simple Express LRS receiver, which there's lots of videos about Express LRS, so I'm not going to explain how that all works. But the difference is, the interesting thing about the Express LRS receiver, all I need to connect is there's one little wire here with this little 4-wire JSTGH connector, and I need to connect that into what is called a UART, or a serial connection, on the flight controller. And basically, if you can see that, I'm just going to clip that in here, and that goes click. But basically that's going into what is called UART 2, or serial 2, which is how it'll show up in the ground control setup software, Mission Planner, or QGroundControl. UART 2 on this Zealot H743 flight controller is the one for, this is techie stuff, skip past it if you don't care, but is the one port on this flight controller that has bidirectional DMA. So it does direct memory access, in other words, bloody fast, for both receive from the transmitter to the receiver and into the flight controller, but also in reverse, because a flight controller sends an awful lot of data back to the transmitter into the ground control station via a back channel. And so the transmit means that this UART here can run at 420,000 bits per second, which is still pretty slow compared to some of the communication technologies that we have these days, but is an awful lot faster than the old-fashioned way of doing it in ArduPilot land, in flight controller land, where it was 57, 600K or even 115K, pretty much, you know, dial-up modem speed. So we got something a little better. So that now is your flight controller, and that is actually enough to get this basic thing working. And so why don't I do that? Got my transmitter here, and just for safety's sake,
telemetry ready.
I am going to use,
Switch warning.
I'm going to use my smoke saver. I really don't think there's could possibly be anything wrong with this circuit, but it's always best to be safe than sorry. So I'll use a smoke saver to connect. This normally won't be in the plane. This is just for getting things working on the bench. And I'll connect the battery to the smoke saver, and nothing. And now we have power. Whoops.
Flaps. Photo cut.
Let me get the right model. All right, so we'll get the transmitter running, and I already have done this before, and I'm not going to show you this on this video. Set up Express LRS, connecting to the transmitter, to the receiver, and flashing it and binding it and all that stuff. It's already connected. It's already, the basic model is already set up. So I'm just going to select that model.
Fly by wire. A flight mode. Disarm.
And here we have the Gee Bee model set up and ready to go. So if I press this button on the smoke saver, that will turn on the power to the power distribution board. That should power the flight controller and will also power the ESC. All right, now what you have noticed here is the green light on the receiver tells me that the transmitter is connected. And guess what? Nothing's happening. Now, why is that? That is because this flight controller, like many ArduPilot flight controllers, have a safety feature called a safety switch. And that flight controller isn't going to power anything on the whole circuit if that safety switch isn't pressed. And right now, that safety switch can't be pressed because it's not even connected. And I want to say that I did this just to show you what happens, and the reality is I forgot about it. And it has happened to me several times before, and it'll probably happen to you. You'll power everything up and you'll think, oh my God, nothing is working. My servos aren't working. What's going on? I have no idea. Look, my receiver's working. Everything seems okay. The answer will be that there is no safety switch, or that you haven't pressed the button on the safety switch. So we're going to power that off again. And apologize for the beeping, but that's the nature of these things, that's going to beep. So this is the safety switch. Safety switches come in various flavors. In this case, this is the one that comes with the Qio-Tek H743 flight controller. It's got a 7-pin JST-GH connector here, and that connects here onto the flight controller into this main switch here, or this main connector here at the top there. And as you can see, these are all labeled. Right here, that's labeled safety buzzer, and that's that particular connector. So that's safety buzzer, and if you can see that here, there's a press button on here. So we'll see how that goes. So right now, what we have connected is power, 4 servos, 1 receiver, and 1 safety buzzer. So let's power that back on again and see what happens.
Telemetry recovered.
Telemetry recovered, green light. We've got our receiver working. Ooh, red lights on the safety switch, and the little singing sound of ArduPilot with the buzz beep that tells me that we're disarmed. Okay, so if I press this, aha, guess what? That's gone solid red, and you know what's happening now? Well, I don't have any action. Oh, but I'll tell you what did happen. Did you hear that? That ESC has actually got power and has registered that it's got power from the battery. So what we're going to have to do now is we're going to have a look at the setup of the outputs on the flight controller, because I have a feeling that I don't have the right setup for the servos. That should be the reason why those servos aren't working. It should have happened when I moved the ailerons and elevator like that, and the rudder, so rudder and elevator, that should have moved. It didn't move. Why not? Next step, let's have a look inside ArduPilot. I'll tell you what I'm doing. This is typically the way you configure anything to do with ArduPilot or the flight controller, and that is to plug a USB cable into the USB port on the side of the flight controller, and then connect that to your computer. So let's do that. And that will come up.
Telemetry recovered.
As you can see, the flight controller came up, the receiver came up, and the safety switch and buzzer came up. Now what won't come up though, because we haven't connected power, is that the ESC won't come up and the servos won't come up. This is just for configuration purposes. Don't make that mistake too. I've done that as well. When you plug in the USB port, you think everything looks okay, do your setup, and then you think, oh, I'm going to try it now, and then nothing works, and you're, oh my goodness, what happened? Well, what you have to remember is that when you actually want the flight controller to do anything, you have to power this end of the flight controller. This end is just for basic configuration and setup. This part needs to be powered in order to get it to do anything. So what we're going to do is we're going to fire up Mission Planner, which does run on the Mac. I'm using a Mac.
Telemetry lost. Telemetry recovered.
What I like about about Mission Planner is it's typically the best way to do setup for your radio and your servos. I split between Mission Planner and QGroundControl. I find QGroundControl the best platform for me out on the field, and I find Mission Planner is great for your configuration and hardware and those kinds of things. There's some things it can do that QGroundControl just can't do. This one is one of those things where QGroundControl kind of does it, but Mission Planner does it better. And here you go. I would love to say again that I did this just to show you as a demonstration. Not true. I made a mistake. Again, it's the kind of mistake that you might make if you think you have everything ready to go and it's not working. Guess what? When I said I plugged that receiver into UART 2, I didn't. And if you look on, unclip the clip and pop it out. Now if you look on here, UART 1 is the one on the inside and UART 2 is the one on the outside. This needs to go into UART 2, and so that is now connected to the right port, and it wasn't connected to the right port before. So let's do that again. Because, just for information, the receiver can connect to the transmitter, but then it's nothing to tell you that the receiver isn't talking to the flight controller until you do something like this, okay? So now what we should find, we connect Mission Planner and go into our setup. And now, look at that. We have action. Aileron channel, or channel, which I have set up on channel 1 on my transmitter, is transmitting and being received on the flight controller on channel 1. And the elevator channel is being received on the flight controller on channel 2. And the rudder is being received on the flight controller on channel 4. So that's working great. And just, I'll show you this. I also have programmed the on the transmitter, the 6 buttons following the instructions from Playlist 360 with a custom curve in the transmitter. You can see that the channel 6
cruise flight mode, manual flight mode, auto tune enabled, auto RTL flight mode, loiter flight mode, fly-by-wire, 8 flight mode.
Okay, plus I have put
disarmed, disarmed,
put that. Arm is on channel 5. Oh, there we go. Arm is on channel 5. Arm is on channel 5. When I arm it, that radio channel 5 comes on, which is a thing you need for Express LRS. Arm on a channel and on a switch. And again, I'll leave that to the Express LRS videos, etc. Okay, so now let's have a look at our servo outputs. And what do we see here? We actually see, well, we see nothing right now. And the answer to that is because we don't have the safety switch switched on. Let's do that. Oh, and look at that. Press the safety switch. Here we go. Straight away, I've got outputs. And as you can see, if I move my ailerons, I get output on the aileron channel. If I move my elevator, I get outputs on the elevator channel, etc. Okay, so nothing's working. It's not moving. What's wrong with that? Back to what I said before. Everything can be configured and set up right, but unless I have power to the servo end of the flight controller, nothing's going to work. So let's do that again. And this is an interesting thing here, but you can power the flight controller off USB power, and you can then, and don't worry, I've done this a number of times before, but you can actually power that, actually put power into the power circuit, and it'll be fine. Okay, so here we go. Now we've got power to the servo rail. You just heard the ESC, that means the ESC is getting power. And what should happen now is if I do elevator, that's working. Well, you can't see it though. Okay, let me just see if I can point that camera around so you can see that. And I'm going to go into manual mode.
Cruise flight mode. Manual flight mode.
All right, so in manual flight mode, the flight controller isn't doing anything. It's just passing the controls all the way through from the transmitter through to the plane. Let's see what happens if I move the elevator. Woohoo! It works. Look at that. And let's do rudder. Okay. Now if I go into fly-by-wire A, and let's just see, is it the right direction? Well, no, rudder is in the wrong direction, as the elevator is correct. Now, I'm not going to do the setup on this. I do have another video on this one that you can watch if you like. There's an important set of steps to do on a ArduPilot flight controller setup plane to make sure that your control surfaces are correct. Whatever you do not do any of it on the transmitter. I'll say this now and I'll probably say it again later. The simple rule for working with a flight controller is you do everything on the flight controller. You don't do expo, you don't do rates, you don't do servo trims, you don't do any kind of min-max calculations, you don't do curves, you don't do mixes, you don't do anything on the transmitter. The transmitter is just here to send the signal to the flight controller. The flight controller does its magic, and that applies now these days to everything. There was one thing until recently where if you wanted to do sort of what they call scaled output, you might do that on your transmitter. You don't have to do that anymore. There's now a set of RC outs that will give you scaled output so that you can use it for your pan and tilts that need to go 360 or whatever way you need that to work. So enough said about that. To get the controls working in the right direction, follow the instructions. Here's the link to my video, link in the description, and all of the information is on the ArduPilot wiki. You can follow it through step by step so you can make sure you get that all set up right. All we're doing now is we're getting the connections working. Woohoo! Connections are working. Wow! What we want to do is we're going to get that motor to run. Now what we need to do to get that motor to run is we have to arm the vehicle and then basically throttle up. Because the vehicle right now, even if I arm the transmitter and, let me go to the radio calibration tab on Mission Planner. And now if I throttle up, you can see the throttle is going up. So as I throttle up, you can see that the radio is sending a signal on the throttle channel, but the motor isn't running. And I don't have a propeller on there for a reason, and that is just because, well, I don't want to hurt myself. So what I can do is I can arm the flight controller. The flight controller needs a special step to arm, and right now it won't even let me arm it because I don't have a GPS, and maybe there's some other things that are missing. Yeah, there's some things happening on the flight controller where it's just not going to arm, it's not ready to fly. It's not going to fly anyway because I don't have a propeller. I'm going to force arm. You heard the beep, that's the buzzer. That's great for out on the field. You can tell the thing to arm and the plane will buzz at you and tell you it's ready to go. So now, if I throttle up, guess what? And I think, that's even running the right way. Yep, there we go. That's running counterclockwise. That just sounds so nice. Okay, so we have a fully functional, I'm going to disarm that right away, fully functional basic setup with the flight controller, the receiver, power, servos. I could plug in the wings and show you the ailerons. It doesn't add anything. And what next? Let's go with this. This is a GPS, and what I'm going to do with the GPS is I'm going to mount that on the front of the plane here. I'm going to actually go in here like this. So given that we're not going to have a pilot in the plane, but we've got this beautiful canopy, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to mount that. This is how that canopy should be mounted anyway. I'm actually going to mount that GPS right on the front there, right under the canopy. And in some respects, that for demo purposes. I could technically mount that GPS maybe underneath. I thought about doing that because it can still get a signal through balsa. And it might look a little better, but part of the point of this plane is to show off the concept of having a flight controller in a classic RC plane. So why not make it obvious that there's a GPS there, and so you'll be able to see that you'll have the GPS there, the flight controller here, and in a second I'll show you how the camera's going to go. But let's do the GPS next. So this GPS, now let's unplug this. You know, technically it might be safe to unplug and plug things while under power, but I don't like to do that. This GPS is a brand new piece of technology from Qio-Tek. This Qio-Tek is the Chinese English name of the company. It actually stands for aerospace. And so Chinese aerospace technology, Qio-Tek, they make this flight controller. They also make this GPS. Now, if you've done a little bit of looking around at flight controllers and GPSs, you've seen things like U-blocks and Baytan, and quite commonly, especially in the ArduPilot Pixhawk world, the M8N GPS, which is actually from U-blocks. But this is an M10S. This is an upgrade. This is the next generation GPS after the M8N, which has been around for years. This is a new GPS. It's able to produce very fast fixes, get more satellites, and produce a very accurate position. But what it also has is this connector here, and I just absolutely love this. This is a CAN bus or a DroneCAN connector. So this doesn't use your old-fashioned UART serial RS232, RS422, whatever modem sound, 57600 or 9600 baud connection to the flight controller. This uses a 1 megabit per second connection with a bus DroneCAN that can have multiple devices connected, and it's all software configurable, and you can get telemetry and debug through the wire to the flight controller, and even send that off to the ArduPilot developer team or to the Qio-Tek developer team to get support. DroneCAN is awesome, and this M10S GPS is awesome. This is my first time trying this one, and I had to learn a little bit about it. One of the funny things is it comes with these two connectors, and I honestly, when I opened the box, I didn't know what to do with that. I thought, oh, well, that'll be the GPS, and maybe this is for the compass. So I plugged that into one of the other connectors, the I2C connector, and it seemed to work. But then I contacted the Qio-Tek support, and they told me, no, don't connect that. You don't actually need it. I almost think I should cut it off, but not quite ready to do that. But the recommendation right now is only connect this one wire, and you connect that to the DroneCAN port, which is as you can see labeled on here. You might have to zoom in a lot, but this is the one on the very far right of the flight controller, and it clicks in, nice solid click when that goes in, and this connector doesn't connect. So with that GPS now connected to the flight controller, I should be able to get a GPS signal. Now I'm in a house, but it's a wooden house. Now I'm not in the concrete apartment that I used to be at before, so I should be able to get a GPS signal. And I also, because this is connected to this end of the flight controller, that GPS should come on even if I power from USB. So I don't need the full power circuit in order to get the GPS to work. So let's power on the GPS and see how that comes up. That's just a bit of a distraction, but what I also have running on Mission Planner right now is it's connected to my ADSB receiver that I have over in the corner here, and you can actually see planes flying around near where I am. I'll zoom in a little bit more just so you can see that they're actually moving. That's my receiver sitting on the roof detecting planes that are literally flying around. In any case, you're not really here for that. It's just kind of fun though. All right, so now we have GPS, and look at that. The GPS comes up. So what we have is a red light, power, blue light, DroneCAN. That means that connected to the flight controller and communicating, and orange light is GPS signal. So if I connect Mission Planner, okay, so what we have is we now have 19 satellites and a 0.64 HDOP, which is good. I mean, honestly, I really don't know what HDOP means or how it works. What I know is you really need to have it less than 1. As long as HDOP is less than 1, then you're good. And 19 satellites inside a house, this GPS is working really, really well. One thing that did happen to me when I was setting up this GPS initially is I was doing it over on my bench, surrounded by my screens and my computer and my keyboard and a bunch of metal and maybe a bunch of circuits that were running, and this GPS did have a hard time getting satellites. It's great over here, and that's only 1 meter away, but when it was right next to everything, it really didn't get a good signal, and I thought it was broken. I thought there was a problem. And all I had to do was just move it a little further away from everything, and it worked, which is another indication of something you have to watch out for when you put a GPS like this in your plane, which is why in this plane here, get that in the frame, when we mount that GPS up here on the plane like that, well, what's going to be near it? And the answer is, well, the flight controller is going to be sort of near it, but nothing else is. The servos are miles away, the motor's a long way away, the ESC, the battery, are way over here at the front. And the camera, I'll show you in a second how the camera's going to go. That's going to be a lot further away from that, that GPS. So I don't think we'll have a problem with the GPS mounting it there. It should be getting a good view of the sky, which is what it needs to get the signal from the GPS. So there's really 2 things left. And these 2 things are somewhat optional. I'm going to go with this one first. This is the Airspeed Sensor. So ArduPilot, in their wiki and the documentation, they strongly recommend putting an airspeed sensor in a plane. In my experience, I'm going to say that's maybe a little dated information. The technology in ArduPilot, the software, the intelligence, the incredible logic, the mathematical applications that are built into the software, the open source software that's inside ArduPilot, are unbelievable. There's some incredibly smart people that are doing some amazing things to make the plane able to do an awful lot of things that would just amaze you. And one of the things that this ArduPilot can do is basically estimate things like wind speed, and therefore the true airspeed of the plane when flying through the air, based on performance through measurements. It has a number of sensors in the flight controller, it's got the GPS, and it's got the software, and it can do, you know, I've flown planes without an airspeed sensor, more or less, with not a problem. Now, there are some applications where you really need an airspeed sensor because you need to be very precise and very sure about the airspeed, because as you probably know, it's the speed of the wind over the wings that gives you your lift and helps the plane to do everything that it does. Well, if you have an airspeed sensor, you can get that very precise control. And so here we have, this is a Qio-Tek ASP5033, a little bit dated technology, and this is an I2C airspeed sensor. It's not CAN based. I2C is also a good non-UART communication technology that's supported by most Pixork style or ArduPilot flight controllers. In some respects I'm using this because that's what I have. I would probably use a CAN airspeed sensor if I had a spare, but I don't happen to have one, and I have this. So the reason why I want to put an airspeed sensor in here is because I'm hoping to do some aerobatics with this plane. So you'll see some interesting things coming up. I mean, take a quick look at this. So what that was a simulator. I ran real flight and I simulated this plane, and just doing some simple aerobatics, and that was all controlled by the flight controller, by ArduPilot in the simulator. So if all goes well, I'll get to do that out with this plane for real, and that's why I think it'll be a smart idea to have an airspeed sensor in the plane. So what I will do when I mount this airspeed sensor in the plane is I'm actually going to mount one of the things that has to happen with an airspeed sensor is it needs to go a long way from the prop wash of the propeller. And so what I want to do is I'm going to mount that out in the wing. So basically this is how this connector will go. This connector will go into the flight controller that will basically go in here. That will basically go down in the plane, and then this long wire will bring the airspeed sensor right out to the wing. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to mount the pitot tube for the airspeed sensor inside the wheel pants. So that's going to basically protrude out the front of the wheel pant on the wing. That'll be a long way away from anywhere being near close to the propeller. So basically that will connect, the pitot tube will connect to these silicon wires that'll connect to the airspeed sensor. The wire will run along here, and that will go into the inside of the plane. So let's quickly disconnect power again, and we're going to connect this airspeed sensor through this. Basically it's a switch, a hub for connecting multiple devices to the same I2C or CAN device. But I'm in fact going to use it so that I can run a cable down from the top of the plane to the bottom of the plane, and then make it easy to disconnect the airspeed sensor in the wing if I need to remove the wings. So that kind of solves two problems in one. So what I'll do is I'll connect this 4-pin JSTGH connector and connect it to this I2C connector here on the flight controller, and that will then go to simulated to out on the wing, and that will be connected to the pitot tube. We'll just leave that out there disconnected for now. And what we'll do, we'll connect up again, power it on. We can see that we have power on the airspeed sensor coming from the I2C. It's also connected through here through the hub. And what we also need to do is connect Mission Planner, and straight away on Mission Planner. So we have airspeed. And the way we can tell that we have airspeed is if I blow, you can see the number go up because the air is speeding down the tube, goes up on the airspeed sensor. Bob's your uncle. It really was as easy as that to connect the airspeed sensor. Yeah, so that's the airspeed sensor. The last thing we're going to do in this wiring connection is to connect the camera. Now my idea that I have on the camera is two things about the camera. One is I need to get it a long way from the other electronics because they tend to interfere with each other. And the second thing is that I want to get the camera, if you remember, I'm planning to put the canopy on the front of the plane like this with the GPS here. Now if I put the camera here, the camera is going to get blocked by that. But what I have here, interestingly, is a little stand that came with one of my other flight controllers for mounting a GPS, usually on a quadcopter or drone. I prefer to just say when the flight controller comes on, the camera comes on and the camera starts recording. Sure, I get a few extra minutes of video that I don't really need and I can just delete that. Much better than me forgetting to press the button or flip the switch and not getting video of an awesome flight, which used to happen. So I don't do that anymore. What I do is I power on the flight controller, the camera comes on and starts recording the video that will come on and record from here. And I'll mount that on the top of the plane on this little antenna thingy here, and looking over the top of the canopy and then over the top of the propeller, but also should have a view of the wings as well. So that, everyone, is everything that we're going to be doing with this Gee Bee Sportster E, powered by the Qio-Tek Zealot H743 flight controller running ArduPilot. It all works. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put all of this into the plane. I'm not going to video that. I'll show you that when it's done. Basically finish setting up the plane. It's coming together a lot faster than I thought, so you know, it may just be a couple more weeks before this plane is ready to fly, which will be a lot of fun. Very, very interesting. I will add that in order to get some of these things to work, yes, it did require some ArduPilot parameters to be configured in Mission Planner or QGroundControl. The parameters are in here. The software is just what's used to set it up. So I will put some of the key parameters in the description for this video, but I'll more importantly put links to other videos where I actually go through the details of setting up those parameters. And later on, when I actually have this plane like fully configured and ready to go, I'm actually going to do an ArduPilot parameter basic setup video that just runs through the basics that you need to get a plane like this in the air running ArduPilot. So stay tuned for that. If you like the video, if you liked some of the video, if you even watched bits of it, please like, please subscribe. There will be, you know, as you've seen with this channel, I do a bunch of different things. There's basic build stuff, like I did with the tail wheel on the previous video. There's complex electronics, there's ArduPilot, and there's flying. I will be flying and I'll have some interesting videos. So if you subscribe, you'll get notified when some of that interesting content pops up online. So there we have it. That's my Qio-Tek Zealot H743, ready to roll, ready to be installed in the beautiful, I really like this model, the beautiful Maxford, USA Gee Bee Sportster E. Tim the Plane Man, over and out.